Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Infinite Inning Reissue series, in which we go back to prior episodes of the Infinite Inning, some that have been out for years, and we clean them up a bit, I hope, and revisit some topics that may still resonate for those who came in later but don't really feel like spelunking through the archives. And I have been told this by some longtime listeners. They enjoy going back and having me do the sorting for them. That's sort of an ancient Greyhound commercial. Remember that? Leave the driving to us. Well, leave the curating to me. And who am I? I happen to be Stephen Goldman, your host, for, as always, a trip back to the past on a mission to better understand the present. This episode, in which we undertook that journey, was number 209, and it is now about 4 years old, having come out in December of 2021. In fact, it is so old that I have to draw your attention to two things that I say in the course of my introduction, which may cause a bit of confusion now. Heck, there may be more than that, in fact, but there are only two that I'm aware of. Ignorance is no excuse, thunders your inner prosecutor. Well, I throw myself upon the mercy of the court. That goes well for some people, not so well for others. The first is that I mentioned that at that time, baseball was in lockdown. Well, it isn't now. It may yet be again about a year from now, a little more than that. They seem to be planning that for 2026, so I guess we have to steel ourselves, but I have some plans for that period anyway, and I very much hope I'll be well positioned to entertain you in other ways. Not that this program is about new baseball, but of course new baseball sometimes feeds our exploration or prompts it of old baseball. The second thing is I made an admiring reference to Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. And yeah, that was before Neil Gaiman was revealed to be a somewhat problematic person. I met him one time at a signing. This was maybe before he was a superstar, and had a brief conversation with him that I've looked back on fondly, and now I feel weird about that. I still admire a lot about the series, so I'm going to leave that part of the discussion in, but to be honest with you, I had bought a revised version, not revised, but reprinted, recolored, improved, right before all that happened. And it was just waiting for the right day, the day that the mood struck, when I would reread a series that I had already read so many times before, including when it had first come out. And I still haven't found that day. I don't know when that day is coming, because I don't know how I will feel about it in light of later revelations. Let me tell you why I selected this particular episode for our reissue this week. Normally, the way my personal schedule works out is that I do these episodes, these reissues, usually on Tuesday or earlier on Wednesday, and then I write my Baseball Prospectus weekly column, you could look it up, over the remainder of Wednesday, often finishing quite late. Fortunately for me, I'm on East Coast time, and we have some BP editors who are on West Coast time, so no one is really inconvenienced, at least as far as I know, by my keeping, West Coast hours myself. Some weeks, I know what I want to write from the get-go. There's something very obvious that is motivating me to put my paws on the keyboard and write 1,500 or 2,000 words. 2 of the last 3 weeks haven't been like that. In fact, and I hate when I do this, but it is part of the process if you write sometimes. I started on a given subject and was bored to tears. And if the author is bored, there's a pretty good chance that the readers are going to be bored too. I made a kind of haphazard attempt to change a current events baseball story into more of a personal or confessional essay, but I was still bored because who cares about me? Well, not me, to be honest. And so I accepted in true Baseball Prospectus fashion that that time was a sunk cost. I did sort of a mental K-turn, and I got out of that blind alley. But then I was bereft of a subject. And for a dangerous moment, I thought about getting in touch with my editor-in-chief, Craig Goldstein, and saying, I don't have anything. I'm just going to bail today, okay? Editors love it when you do that. And you can't. You can't stay in my line of work and do that very often, if at all. Early in my career, roughly around the time that I met Neil Gaiman. I'm not saying these events are linked or anything. An editor said to me that blown deadlines are for near-fatal illnesses and deaths in the family. And I really have adhered to that all across my career because a writer is only as useful as he is reliable. Yes, you have to be good, but if, say, you're also getting drunk and missing deadlines, then they can't use you after a while. The reason for this ethos, I suppose, is the same in every profession that requires workers to deliver something on a given schedule, on a reliable schedule, whether it's stories about the shadow for a pulp magazine or widgets for a cell phone. The pulp magazine is more applicable to what we do at Baseball Prospectus, but it would have been more obvious then because the magazine wouldn't have gone out on time if Walter Gibson had just not turned in a 50,000-word shadow story that week. You cannot imagine how greatly I honor Walter Gibson for keeping that schedule for as long as he did. Well, we don't have it that rough. And on a website, I suppose it's less obvious when something is missing. And yet, the people who make the publication have expectations, the readers have expectations, and I have expectations for myself. So I was sitting here still trying to figure out what I was going to write when I saw a story that resonated with the infinite inning. And it's something that, if you read it, you'll see I referred to this show, not just this specific episode, but the infinite inning in general. Because today, as I say these words, the Surgeon General of Florida and the Governor of Florida announced that they intend to suspend all vaccine mandates in the state, including for children, who will no longer be expected to be vaccinated for things like chickenpox, which I personally had at the late age of 16 or 17, and it was pure fun, let me tell you, not to mention measles, mumps, rubella, and so on. There was no vaccine for chickenpox when I had it. I was sitting in a study hall. I looked up to see a girl not too far across the room, said girl sporting a fairly spotty complexion at that moment that was not just teenage acne, who had turned to a friend of hers and said, "Yeah, I have chickenpox, but I figure everyone has already had it, so I came to school anyway." Well, I had not had it, and I started edging my desk away rapidly in almost comedic fashion, but it was too late. Jill, if you're out there, you know who you are, and I'm going to settle up with you one day. So in Florida, at least, following Texas's lead to some extent, we are returning to not a pre-20th century way of doing business or a 19th century way, but an 18th century way. We're practically back to Shakespeare, because I can show you arguments from when Benjamin Franklin was young, and the guy was born in 1706, about vaccinations for smallpox and whether they were a good idea or not. We have been litigating this stuff for better than 300 years. And among the many reasons that life expectancy is so much higher than it was in 1706 is because we have vaccines, because we have antibiotics. And yeah, we ask everyone to use them. Those who don't are free riders on everyone who does. As I explain in the piece, the reason that this is an infinite inning story is because since we talk about so many 19th and early 20th century ball players on this show, I have had to say so often that a given player died of a disease like tuberculosis, a communicable disease that we can now prevent. Some of them years later, some of them at mid-career. I've had to do it so often I feel self-conscious about it. But this episode is largely about a player who suffered in exactly that way. Episode 209 begins with the story of an ill-considered trade between the Braves and the Pirates, but then in the second half contains a rather lengthy story from the 1930s, which is late for this sort of thing, regarding a Cardinals, a Branch Rickey prospect, who suffered very badly from contracting the disease, and the consequences for both his career and his life were significant, severe, final. I returned to him in the piece, as well as other players who suffered from tuberculosis, who we've talked about here, including, of course, Christy Mathewson and Addie Joss. I don't want to go on too much longer because I'm going to spoil both the column and the reissue episode. I just want to say this much, and I've said things like this before, but they're worth reiterating, especially here in 2025. And this regards Florida's Surgeon General analogizing vaccine mandates to slavery, which I take to mean that anyone telling you that you're required to do something with your body is treating you as a slave. And the irony of people who feel that a woman's reproductive health is everyone's business but the woman's would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic. And yes, from a pure libertarian point of view, your right to do what you want, how you want, when you feel like it is being limited by vaccine mandates. But guess what? We also don't let you run through red lights. We don't let you sniff cocaine or sell it. And I don't know how you run your household, but we don't let the kids leave roller skates on the stairs because someone is going to die. And speaking of those kids, every single state makes them go to school. Now, they may be homeschooled, and increasingly states may not check on those kids, so they're not learning anything, and they're not prepared to be an asset to our nation. It's your kid, isn't it? Doesn't the parent always get the final say? What they read, what they see, and what shots they take. Why can't you run red lights, which don't apply to you as a sovereign citizen, with that same child, Junior, strapped to the hood? That's illegal. Why do we have regulations that say that workers at Chipotle cannot go to the bathroom, wipe themselves with their bare hands, and then prepare your burrito? And the short version, without my going on for another 15 minutes, is we have experience with all this stuff, and it's deleterious to the community. It is bad, and it is dangerous. Look up Typhoid Mary. Same idea. If she was shedding via her body bacteria everywhere, isn't that her business? And so once again, we're down to that age-old question of my rights versus your rights. What happens when the right that you want to exercise endangers my right to live, or vice versa? What happens when you sending your unvaccinated kid to school causes my child to become dangerously ill, which unfortunately I've had experience with my own kids, with lifelong implications. And I can tell you, no one did that on purpose. It wasn't one of these things you can be vaccinated for. But I regret that every single day of my life, and worry and mourn what might have been for my child that would be different if they had not been affected in that way. And you know the answer, right? It's the same reason that you can't run naked onto the field during the next Red Sox at Yankees game, no matter how badly you want to, because no one wants to see that. Just like they don't want to experience tuberculosis or mumps, measles, or rubella at your hands. And if I may quote so august an authority as Mr. Spock, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Without that understanding of how communities function, well, they don't, and a nation goes to hell. That's all for me for this reissue episode. You may hear from me as I paper through some old breaks, and again at the end, we'll take a quick break now. And on the other side, one of the first times, not the last, that the Pirates traded a future MVP. We are in deepest December. Baseball is in a lockout, you might have heard. So I hope you will have a little patience if we get away from baseball a bit on this week's show, as we sometimes do here on the program. Not completely. My first story is about managers, and my second longer tale will be about a ball player, a secretly great catcher of the past, if the hype is to be believed. Our conversation, though, only has as much to do with baseball as everything has to do with baseball, as ball players are people and succeed and fail at about the same rate we do in non-baseball endeavors. Actually, here's a good question. Do they succeed and fail at a higher or lower rate than we do on the field? If a player hits 250, is he doing better than most of us do in our life decisions, our equivalents to at-bats? I can't pour a cup of coffee without spilling something, so it's possible. This week, the Mets and A's hired new managers, Buck Showalter and Mark Kotsay, respectively. They are all dressed up with nowhere to go until the lockout is over. All 30 jobs have now been filled. It's been such a slow, stentorian march away from the end of the season that I've almost lost track of which positions have changed. I think it's the Cardinals replaced Mike Schilt with Oliver Marmol. The Padres canned Jace Tingler. That's a really impolite way of putting it. It's a lot too blunt. But Mr. Tingler has been defenestrated. That's still pretty rough. And replaced with Bob Melvin, which led to the A's replacing Melvin with Kotsay. And, of course, Buck Showalter takes over for Luis Rojas with the Metropolitans. He's now the Yankees' third base coach. Rojas, that is. I think that's the lot. I used to get excited by these sorts of things because of the potential change of approach they'd bring. But since the golden age of managers, the John McGraw days, they are more vehicles for the diktats of the front office, and that is particularly true in the modern era of baseball thinking when things like just slow motion and replay, not to mention advanced metrics and other forms of really looking at the game in a granular way, have debunked a lot of the tools that managers used to use. Think about Gene Mauch. Gene Mauch, in a lot of ways, was a very successful manager in that he had a career in the major leagues that lasted almost 30 years. And yet, although he did make a couple of postseasons, he never won anything. And you go back to his record and you say, okay, he was famous for being a one-run guy, for being a small ball guy. And then you realize that there were periods, years, seasons, in which even managing the Angels with the designated hitter, that he was bunting 200% more often than any of his contemporaries. And you say, how much did that cost those teams? Today, they would handcuff him to the bench. They'd see his hands about to go up to give the sign, and some coach would sap him with a blackjack. I have such a great job. So, as a result of that very warranted fear of being bonked over the head, today they do a lot less. In any given year, there are exceptions. Coaches who seem to exceed or underperform the boring norm. Gabe Kapler was that guy this year, the manager who had a magical ability to press the right button. I want to see him do it 2 years in a row, though. Remember, repeatability is the litmus test of any scientific experiment. If you can't redo it, maybe you can't trust your results. Baseball Reference lists 828 managers going back to the 19th century. If you look at that list alphabetically, you see right towards the top, one-season wonder Doug Allison, a catcher born in 1846. Doug was a veteran of the Union Army, although I don't think he saw combat. He managed the 1873 Elizabeth Resolutes of the National Association, and they went 3-20. This is so early in professional baseball that I doubt anyone had Buck Showalter-like expectations of a 26-year-old player-manager coaching a team that dwelt in the salt marshes of New Jersey, but you never know. I mean, the Mets play in Willets Point, and how different are the chop shops of Willets Point from the salt marshes of New Jersey? Fewer birds. There's one example right off the top. You've never seen a plover attend a Mets game or a belted kingfisher? You thought that was a laughing gull, but no, those were just the Mets fans. And they weren't laughing, they were crying. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. The Resolutes, as I just indicated, played in Elizabeth, New Jersey, by the way, which I regret to say is roughly coterminous with the ominous industrial landscape that most people who fly into Newark Airport and then just look south or travel directly south on the turnpike experience as soon as they get to the Garden State. They take in these massive chemical refineries and a sky that is slate-colored, even if it's a bright and sunny day, and they might take a deeply invigorating whiff of the odors that emanate therefrom, and they say, garden? What garden? And that's a bit unfair to Elizabeth, which is a thriving city with a growing Latino population. Yeah, it's kind of parked on the Arthur Kill, which is surrounded by those refineries, and you kind of expect it to burst into flames like the Cuyahoga did back in the day, or that maybe you could just walk across it, not because you have messianic powers, but because it has a density like a well-set pudding. And we all know, whether we like it or not, that almost every state, probably every state, has some spot that's like that, but only we make a point of showing ours off as soon as you arrive. And that mess has been there over 100 years, which means that when Doug Allison played there, it hadn't happened yet. That's how long ago it was. The city was just industrializing at that time, with the Singer Sewing Machine Company building a big plant the same year that Grand Army of the Republic Doug arrived. The Elizabeth Resolutes didn't last long, but Singer was a major employer in the town for 109 years, which is to say it was a much bigger deal that they arrived than it was that Doug showed up. That's my whole point in bringing up dear departed Doug, who left us in December 1916. Of the 828 managers, 498, or 60%, managed at least 150 games in the major leagues, or approximately one full season, very close to one under the pre-expansion schedule. Of those, 183, or 37%, a little over a third, made it all the way to the postseason at least once. And that's a very good percentage for baseball. You hit .333 in baseball, you win MVP awards. They give you a plaque at the Hall of Fame. So baseball managers hit .370. Conversely, almost two-thirds of them failed, failure being what baseball creates best. And I think we all know that those are the odds. I think general managers and owners know that. They may convince themselves otherwise, but to look at the history of all of those hirings and the inevitable firings is to see people sell the optimistic version and then accept the pessimistic version, which, at the risk of sounding cynical, is the accurate version. Billy Herman, the Hall of Fame second baseman, is actually a great example of this. He got to manage twice, once with the Pittsburgh Pirates in the late 1940s, once with the Boston Red Sox in the mid-60s. It was 1964, the year of the Beatles and Billy Herman. Between those two teams, he got all of 3 full seasons, and his record is like a modern version of dear departed Doug's. No one really goes 2-23 or the equivalent thereof during a full season in modern baseball. There are too many breaks on things, such as the draft and free agency, to prevent teams from going into that total free fall most of the time, but his teams lost 192 and 90 games. Herman took over the Pirates for the 1947 season. They had last won a pennant 20 years earlier. That was the team that got swept by the 1927 Yankees. In the years since, the team had generally been good, posting winning seasons in 14 of 19 campaigns. They just weren't quite able to get the last couple of pieces together. Barney Dreyfuss, Barney passed away, and his heirs really couldn't run the team as well as he did. Also, there was a war or two, and they just started slipping backwards. In 1946, and this is with all their players back, they went 63 and 91. They had actually been better with all the 4F guys, and after that campaign, they fired Frankie Frisch, their manager for the previous several years. The managing owner, Frank McKinney, who had just bought the team from the heirs of Mr. Dreyfuss, was keen on getting Herman as manager for reasons that aren't really clear. He hadn't managed in the majors to that point. He had spent 2 years in the service, so although he had played very well in 1946, it's not exactly as if he had been impressing people with his coaching acumen. He just hadn't been around. There were 4 owners in that partnership: McKinney, John Galbraith, who would have the team for much longer in the end, Thomas Johnson, and Bing Crosby. Yes, Harry Lillis Crosby, the crooner. Herman was McKinney's guy, and it's just hard to imagine what the conversation must have been like as they were casting around for replacements for the Fordham Flash. Somebody must have said, "Joe McCarthy's available, boo-boo, boo-boo-boo." "No, Herman," McKinney replied. "But why, boo-boo?" "Well, he did hit .298 this year, but what does that really mean in terms of knowing how to run a team?" In any case, his argument won the day. I'm not sure how tampering rules worked back then. But the way Herman told it years later, McKinney called him and said, "I really want you as manager." And Herman said, "Great. How are you going to get me away from Boston?" That's who he had been playing for. He was still an active player under contract. "Gonna swing a trade with the Braves for your services," says McKinney. "Great," says Herman. "Gonna trade our best player to get you." No, says Herman. "It's gonna be great," says McKinney, and Herman says, "No, it won't, because I'm 38 years old. Have you ever seen a 38-year-old second baseman? They dig fresher specimens out of the Siberian permafrost." But too late. On September 30th, 1946, the Pirates swapped third baseman and outfielder Bob Elliott, as well as a reserve catcher, to the Boston Braves for Herman, pitcher Elmer Singleton, outfielder Stan Wenzel, and shortstop Whitey Weitelman. Elliott, already a 3-time All-Star and 2-time top 10 MVP finisher at that point, hit a great .295 with a .398 on-base percentage and .485 slugging in 5 years with the Braves, and won an MVP award in 1948. Herman got hurt, played a total of 15 games as a Pirates player, managed them for up to the last week of the 1947 season, at which point he resigned under pressure. But that was all in the future as of his hiring in October 1946. Billy Herman, the new Pirate manager, faces one of the best opportunities in big league baseball, said the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, coming here to take charge under the aegis of a new ownership which intends to plow back profits in order to get the team out of the second division doldrums. Herman will be given the sort of cooperation which every manager, new or old, needs to produce a winner. Like many another baseball man, Herman has the technical know-how. There are a couple of assumptions in there which were dangerous to make and proved not to be true. One, Herman did not get the cooperation. He was McKinney's pick, not general manager Roy Hamey's, and Hamey did not want him at all. Second, he in no way displayed the technical know-how, particularly when it came to the bane of all freshman managers, when and how to make a pitching change. Within 11 months, he was gone. "We've talked to Billy at some length," McKinney said. "He's not apologizing and we are not indicting him, but we felt that some changes should be made. Bill felt it would be in the best interest of all concerned if he resigned. We still have the greatest respect for his ability and his managerial strategy." So in less than a year, they had gone from trading an all-star and future MVP, a guy who wouldn't look totally out of place on the wall up in upstate New York, just to get this guy's butt on the bench, to saying, "Well, I still respect him." That's why you have to temper your enthusiasm when a manager is hired. It's at this point in this kind of story where I usually say, not even Earl Weaver could have won with this roster. I'm not totally sure of that. I mean, it wasn't a championship team no matter what, but it had the bones of a .500 team with some good luck. The Pirates had a bad offense, a bad defense, and bad pitching, but by bad, I don't mean that bad. I don't mean abjectly miserable. I just mean below average. And it seems likely, well, let me put that a different way. It seems possible that a better manager could have gotten a little more out of them. And indeed, the very next season, 1948, Billy Meyer, Herman's replacement, picked up a Manager of the Year award for going 83-71 with a very similar roster. So to a certain extent, Hamey, who said, apparently off the record or temporarily off the record, given that I'm here telling you about it, "I don't believe Herman has the stuff to be a big league manager. If we give him another chance in 1948, we would just be postponing the inevitable and go suffering through another season. It's best to get it over now." Fair enough, and I'm sure he felt validated when the team improved and Billy Meyer picked up that award, but it's important to note that that's as good as it got. The Pirates had some very bad seasons in their immediate future with not just Meyer, but Fred Haney, who would later win a World Series with the Braves, and then Bobby Bragan, and all they did was lose miserably. It just didn't matter who the manager was when the team was Ralph Kiner, Murray Dixon, and I don't have a third guy, Joe Garagiola. And that's why our attention is better placed not on managers being hired, but on general managers. On Hamey, in this example, Hamey worked in the Yankee system under Director of Player Development George Weiss. After a stint as American Association president, he returned to the majors as general manager of the Pirates. He held that position from 1946 through 1950, and, as I just suggested, when the team stagnated, he was replaced by Branch Rickey, under whom things got even worse, but they eventually did start to rebound after he left, and eventually many of his acquisitions would be part of the 1960 championship team. After a few years back with the Yankees as Weiss's assistant, Weiss had become general manager of the Yankees at the exact moment that Hamey had become general manager of the Pirates. He was hired as Phillies general manager in 1954, and he took that team from 77-77 to 64-90 in a few short years, and was fired after the 1959 season. The team bottomed out 2 years later, losing 107 games, but rebounded under his replacement, John Quinn. Finally, the Yankees took him back, forcing Weiss into retirement after the 1960 season and hiring Hamey. Hamey had the team from 1961 through 1963, and it went to the World Series all 3 years. But to borrow from Barack Obama, he didn't build that. That was Weiss's construct. Hamey was forced out for Ralph Houck so that Yogi Berra could become manager, or more because Houck needed an escape up to the front office and Berra was sort of the fall guy. But ask yourself what happened to the Yankees as soon as 1965. Hamey's managers with the Phillies were Steve O'Neill, Mayo Smith, and Eddie Sawyer, and they're an instructive bunch too. O'Neill was the manager of the World Series winning 1945 Tigers. Didn't help the Phillies. Smith would win the World Series with the 1968 Tigers. Didn't help the Phillies. Sawyer had helped the Phillies, but in 1950, when he won a pennant with the Whiz Kids. Maybe O'Neill and Sawyer had forgotten their magic touch by the time they got to Philadelphia and worked with Roy. Philadelphia may in fact have that effect on people, or maybe Smith hadn't found his magic touch yet. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the outcomes of those teams had less to do with the waiter serving the meal than it did with the chef cooking it. Maybe the chef left out a key ingredient. That reminds me of a lesson contained in a very old waiter joke, one of the ancient "there's a fly in my soup" lineage of humor, if you can call them humorous. It goes like this: for 20 years, the same customer visited a certain restaurant and without fail always ordered the same dish, borscht. In all that time, he never once complained about the food or service, the model customer. One evening, when the waiter had served the customary plate of borscht, the customer called him back to the table. "Waiter, taste this borscht." "Why? What's the matter with it?" "Just taste it." "Listen, it's too cold, it doesn't taste right, whatever. I'll take it back and bring you another serving." "Taste the borscht." "Why should I taste? You don't want it, you don't want it. So I'll bring you a change. Why should I argue with a good customer?" The customer, his face dark with fury, stood up. "For the last time, taste the borscht." Intimidated, the waiter sat down. All right, if you insist." He looked around. "Where's the spoon?" "Aha!" exploded the customer. A missing shortstop, it turns out, is much like a missing spoon. And here's a second lesson for you. Gags like that will not only cost you a pennant, they earn you a one-way ticket to the infinite inning. If holidays you are indeed celebrating, and why not? Happy birthday to you too, even if it's not your birthday. You know, sometimes I have this conversation with my wife. I'll say, "You know, Steph, I saw this baseball book online, this rare old baseball book. I'd really like to have it for my library, but they're charging $150 for it, and I usually don't spend that much. And she'll say, well, what are you going to do? And I'll say, well, it is my birthday. I recommend this solution to a lot of problems. Say you are out at a restaurant, I mean when we are not being inundated by a virus, and you've finished a sumptuous meal, and then the waiter hands you the dessert menu. And you might say, well, I really shouldn't, patting your tummy, but it is my birthday. Doesn't matter what day of the year it is. No one's going to call you on it. It's just a lie that you can tell yourself that permits all sorts of outrageous behavior, self-indulgent behavior, really. It is my birthday. And then you order the Black Forest cake, maybe 2 slices, 7-layer cake. Can you get a good 7-layer cake anymore? When I was a kid, that was the in cake. Every diner had a 7-layer cake. Every high-end 4-star, 5-star Michelin Guide restaurant had a 7-layer cake. Now no one has 7-layer cake. Then again, I wouldn't know. I haven't left this room in 2 years. But seriously, watch the Great British Baking Show every year. They'll make a Charlotte Russe before they make a 7-layer cake. And now that I've got you running to the refrigerator to claw through the detritus of previous meals and see if you've got any Charlotte Russe leftovers, allow me to thank you for attending this, the second to last infinite inning of 2021. As I said mere moments ago, this is the second to last episode of 2021. I intend, fate willing, to be here in 2022, which would be, let's see, we began the show in 2017, so 17, 18, 19, 20, I am counting on my fingers. Year 6? Is that possible? I have grown not only old, but nearly blind in the service of my country. George Washington said that. He deserved to say it. It was a big moment. I do not deserve to say it. Actually, I'd already grown blind by the time I showed up here, but I'll take the sympathy anyway. It is my birthday, after all. My intention for next week's final show of the year is to repeat the experiment I did at this time in 2020 and tell you a fictional version of baseball history. I should say some baseball historical fiction. That would be the human English way to put it. And in a sense, this story is a sequel to last year's, which appeared in episode 167. If you want to check it out, was a story of a young Babe Ruth and a very young Louis Armstrong meeting in New York circa 1922. This one will be a tale of Lou Gehrig. That one in the end was light. This one is kind of dark. So I hope you enjoy that. Assuming I get through it. I'm sort of frightened committing to this in public. There's a whole lot of reading and doing voices and things. And as you know, as you just heard, I do not do voices well. I barely do my own voice well. And here's another thing I don't do well, transition into a break, but it is time for that. One more story for you. As I said, a catcher who at least one person insisted was one of the greatest of all time. I suspect you might not agree, but I have reasons for talking to him at this particular time and place. So please, wait a second. Did I say talking to him? I mean talking about him. This is not a seance. Come in, Joe DiMaggio. Send us a sign. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Maybe we don't want to know. Okay, so as I was saying, stand by, hang fire for just long enough for us to endure this brief intermission. Because as it was time to take a break now in 2021, so it is time to take a break in 2025. I'll see you on the other side, or past me, Will. You know how it is. You know, when you've been doing this show as long as I have, or a show as long as I have, you start to have this feeling of deja vu at times, because there are certain things, and I find this appropriately enough in my marriage too, in all of my friendships, there are certain stories that are important to you, certain things that in your life consistently stimulate you to expression over and over again. And so you have this sense, I told you this story, right? Or I said that before. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before. And then I start saying that so often, I might have mentioned this before, maybe I told you this one, that I feel boring saying that. And I know this happens to people. You can see it sometimes on shows that satirize other shows. John Oliver does this all the time. He'll pick someone, on CNN or MSNBC or Fox who has certain crutches when they talk or bring up the same topic again and again, and he'll put together a clip reel of dozens of occasions of them bringing up the same thing over and over again. Just this week, I was listening to Paul Scheer and Amy Nicholson talk about the movie Love Actually on their Unspooled podcast, which I rather like. I recommend it if you're into discussions about movies. And Love Actually is an easy target. You know, I confess that when I first saw that movie, I liked it. And then when you walk away from it, when you get 5 minutes from it, the flaws, some of which are obvious when you see it, but you still leave with a good feeling. And then you look at it more closely, or really just get away from the visceral feeling of love, actually, then you start to realize it's awful. I did not realize this because I was never a big watcher of his shows, but the defrocked MSNBC host Chris Matthews apparently had an almost unhealthy obsession with the film. And so he'd be talking about whatever the news subject of the day was. The Congress can't pass that bill. It's kind of like Love Actually. And he just did this again and again. And they ran a good, 30 seconds of him invoking this really, when you get down to it, trite story that, again, still has some good vibes and some amusing parts if you don't question them too closely. And I bring all this up because I'm about to mention a panel from Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and I feel certain, because it's something that weighs on me in its way, it is part of sort of the attic of my mind, the junk that's stuffed in there, and I don't mean to insult it by saying junk, but just the congeries of random accumulated inputs that I've experienced in my life. I feel certain that somewhere in the previous 209 episodes, I've mentioned it, but maybe I haven't. There is a panel in an early issue of Neil Gaiman's Sandman that sums up some of the unfairness of life. It came to me twice recently. Again, it comes to me often, but once in a kind of benign way, and then more seriously in recent days. If you haven't read Sandman, and there's going to be a Netflix adaptation next year, and there's an Audible adaptation, if you're into listening to, well, you're listening to me, you're into listening to podcasts, but into stories that are dramatized. It's like an old radio show. It's very good, and they have just completed their second season, so you can get a good chunk of it if you subscribe to Audible. And no, I do not get a kickback for that. I would like a kickback for something. I think the 7-layer cake people should really reach out to me after this episode, don't you? Well, Sandman posits that there are a handful of anthropomorphized beings. Gods isn't quite the right descriptor. They kind of transcend gods, who personify and rule over key aspects of our lives. There's desire, despair, they go hand in hand. The titular character is Dream. He's never called Sandman. We just understand that that's one of the ways he's been described over his long existence. His younger sister is Death. And contrary to how Death is always depicted in most stories, Gaiman's Death is a no-drama goth girl. And in this important story in the series early on, Dream accompanies her on her rounds as she takes people. And in the course of that tale, he sees her usher many people out of this life, and at one point, painfully, she visits a newborn. And as she picks up the newborn says, "That's it? That's all I get?" Recently, my wife was flipping channels, or I don't know, and I landed on an episode of Nature on PBS. And that show's been running for years and years, and I used to watch it sometimes on rainy afternoons and inevitably fall asleep. That's because the narrator that they used for the first, 50 decades of yes, it's been running for 500 years, had this somnolent approach and this just very dry tone. The zebra cautiously approaches the okapi. It has confused them. From the back, it looked like a potential mate, but from the front, oh my God. Fortunately, they've since mixed it up and got a jolt of electricity into the narrators. And in this recent episode, the show was detailing the short life of an African watering hole. It is, for a good chunk of the year, a dry divot in a plain, and then seasonally, it fills up, hosts an abundance of life, and then dries up again. Frogs lay their eggs in it, the eggs hatch and become tadpoles, and all these other critters eat the tadpoles, including what seemed like a pretty scary spider that dangles over the water, and as a tadpole comes up near the surface, no more tadpole. And I said to the TV, as the tadpole disappeared into the spider's clutches, that's it? That's all I get? And you start realizing that it's not just a panel in Sandman. It's not an unusual thing. It's kind of universal. And I don't know why. I guess being baseball-minded, it put Bill DeLancey in my mind. DeLancey was a catcher. He was born in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1911. He died in Phoenix in 1946 and is buried there. Some very simple math will tell you he got only 35 years on this planet. More than some, less than others. And Bill could play. He was a left-handed hitting catcher. Here's a kind of fun trivia question. If I asked you the name of the leading left-handed hitting catcher of all time, in terms of games caught, who would you have guessed? Now, I would have said Yogi Berra and flashed a smug smile. Put it in the form of the question, who is Yogi Berra? But he wasn't. He was number 3. The left-handed hitter who caught the most games. I would not have come up with this in a million years. A.J. Pierzynski. Bill Dickey was second, and 4 games behind him was ol' Yogi. Would you have gotten that one? That's total games. Only 10 catchers in modern history have played 2,000 or more games. They wear down faster than that, as you know. I'm not just talking games caught, although that is the vast majority of what we're referring to, but also occasional appearances at first base or left field or designated hitter. The list is Pudge Rodriguez, Carlton Fisk, Ted Simmons, Gary Carter, Bob Boone, Johnny Bench, Yadi Molina, Yogi Berra, Jason Kendall, and Pierzynski. I'm not sure if any active player, aside from Molina, will have that kind of endurance. Maybe Salvador Perez. He's got 1,100 or so games under his belt heading into his age 32 season. Of course, they have to keep playing full seasons, and there's the possibility that having not gotten one in 2020, that we might not get another one in 2022, both given the current trajectory of the pandemic, although hopefully by late March, early April, things will be looking better, hopefully, finally, but also, of course, due to the inevitable lockout. Bill DeLancey didn't play anything like 2,000 games or 1,000. He started playing professional baseball in 1930 at 18 years old and was signed by Branch Rickey's Cardinals chain. In 1931, when he was 20, playing for the Springfield Cardinals of the Class C Western Association, he hit .329 with a .414 slugging percentage. No, that's not right. A .414 on-base percentage and a slugging percentage of nearly 600 with 29 doubles, 20 triples. You like it when your catcher hits 20 triples, 18 home runs, and 110 RBIs. This was very good by the standards of the Western Association, the Major Leagues, and Europa of the Moons of Jupiter League. I don't know if he was truly an Adley Rutschman at that moment, but it looks like he was an Adley Rutschman, especially because the next year he was promoted to Columbus of the American Association, high minors, and despite being only 21, way under the average age of the league, he hit .285 with a .376 on-base percentage and a .527 slugging percentage, 17 doubles, 11 triples, 21 home runs in 123 games. Parenthetically, almost every week on this show, I get to say something to you like the Springfield Cardinals of the Class C Western Association, and I get a thrill from it every time. And you know why? I think it's because even though it's just the information, this is where the player was, this was his level of competition, I'm doing a little homage to Charles Schultz and Charlie Brown's favorite ballplayer, Joe Schlabotnik. When he talked about Schlabotnik, or Charlie Brown did, Schultz tended to mention his level. So, for example, on July 30th, 1964, Charlie Brown tells Schroeder that Schlabotnik has been sent down to Stumptown of the Green Grass League. At other times, it's Hillcrest of the Green Grass League or the Waffletown Syrups. Schlabotnik managed the Waffletown Syrups, but was almost immediately fired for calling a squeeze play with no one on base. I think the general manager was Roy Hamey. I need a Waffletown Syrups jersey. Bill DeLancey got his first cup of coffee in the majors in September 1932, but he was blocked for a year because the Cardinals had some good catchers. He finally made it up for good in 1934, backing up, at least initially, a veteran catcher, Virgil Spud Davis. Spud could really hit, but over the course of that season, DeLancey ate into Spud's potato because he could hit too, and he was the better defender. When the Cardinals came from behind to beat the Giants to the National League pennant last day of the season, it was DeLancey who started every game of the World Series, which they won. In the regular season, he played 93 games, he hit .316, .414 on-base percentage, slugged .565. His World Series was less successful on a personal basis, but the Cardinals won, and forever after, DeLancey was part of it. The Gas House Gang, Frankie Frisch, Ripper Collins, Leo DeRocher, Pepper Martin, Ducky Medwick, Dizzy, and Paul Dean. That last, Paul Dean, not really all that daffy, even though papers tried to make that nickname stick, was key to DeLancey breaking into the lineup. Bill and Paul had been a very successful battery in the minors, and Paul wanted Bill DeLancey to be his personal catcher. Eventually, Dizzy insisted on throwing to him as well. As owner Sam Breeden later remembered, DeLancey was a hard hitter who had an accurate arm and brashness that enabled him to take charge of a pitcher and a ball game even when he was fresh out of the bushes. So you have a catcher who can hit and is a good handler of pitchers, the preference of a future Hall of Famer and his brother, and he was only 22. And yet, at that moment, as they dogpiled on the field, at the end of the World Series, his career was almost over. He played more often in 1935, but that fall, something went very wrong. The way DeLancey told it, it was a damp October day 2 weeks after the 1935 season closed. We were visiting the Mrs. folks at Westville, Illinois, and some of the boys wanted to play ball. It pleased them when I joined them, just in street clothes, you know. I pitched for my side, went 16 innings. Then someone suggested we go dove shooting. An hour after turning in, I was in bed violently ill with a temperature of 104. A pain developed in the right side of my chest. The run-up to that, it seems innocuous, right? He played some ball, he did some hunting, but I often think of the day that Franklin Roosevelt manifested his polio, which is caused by a virus. You've heard of viruses, right? It was August 10th, 1921. He was at his vacation home at Campobello in New Brunswick, Canada. He went swimming, then came inside, and on his way to changing out of his wet clothes, he went, "Oh, the mail came. I got some mail." So he sat down and sorted through it. Maybe he got a chill. Maybe the exertion of the swimming or the sorting of the mail while being damp had something or nothing to do with this virus manifesting itself in his body. And yet, I'm sure, over the rest of his life, over the, 24 roughly more years that he had to live, he thought many times, what if I hadn't gone through the mail? What if I had dried off right away? I'm no doctor, but I suspect that would have been a red herring, just as the stickball, the street baseball, and the hunting trip was a red herring for Bill DeLancey. He was hospitalized with what at first was thought to be a transient lung infection, just maybe a chance of the flu. The doctors didn't think it was any more serious than that, not for a young man. Doctors are not always right, though, on first impression. He was suffering from what at first appeared to be pneumonia and a resultant case of pleurisy, an infection of the lungs, and his lungs were filling with fluid, drowning him. Doctors, it was said, had drained several pints of fluid from his right lung. I hear that and I look down at my own chest and I think about the relative size of one's lungs and the size of a pint. When I was in school, elementary school up through high school, at lunch you would buy a half pint of milk. I'm guessing a lot of you did the same. You could get chocolate milk too. Do you remember? Not 7-layer cake, but you could get chocolate milk. Do you remember those little half pints? For an adult, it's probably like 2 sips. Still, multiply that volume by whatever your definition of several pints is, and think of your chest and how little of it would take to fill up that entire volume. Not that many. So he was clearly in a mortal situation, and his condition was up and down for a while. He was in the hospital for months, all of November and on through December. During the winter meetings, there were articles saying that he was on the trading block, as if the writers weren't aware that the only block he was on was the one in which your soul is weighed, the chopping block, the Grim Reaper standing nearby and sharpening up his scythe. As of December 16th, doctors had drained his right lung 14 times and were starting to say things like, hey, he might not be in shape to play come spring. He might not be in shape to play ever. And he wasn't. His lungs were done. Bill DeLancey, said the team doctor, is a pretty sick boy. The Cardinals wrote him off for the season, hyping a young catcher named, well, this is kind of the funny part in all this, no one was sure what his name was. Baseball Reference lists him as Bruce Ogrodowski, but papers at the time called him Ambrose Ogrodowski, which was his birth name and something we could have used. There have been very few Ambroses in Major League history. One writer, clearly talking to Branch Rickey on the phone and misunderstanding what he was saying, typed him up as not Ambrose, but Hank, and his last name as Ogrodowski with an apostrophe, as if he were Irish. Fair play on ya, Ogrodowski. He was apparently some kind of Irish-Polish hybrid in this writer's mind, the green kielbasa of Dublin. I am thinking, parenthetically, if any of you out there listening happen to be an Irish and Polish couple, I don't care which partner is which, I'm begging you, procreate. We need the green kielbasa in baseball. And because it's unlikely that any single baby is going to grow up to be a ball player, you're going to have many children to increase the odds. So get to it. I'll wait. Ogrodowski will receive a great deal of serious attention in spring training, Rickey said. I think it's possible he may develop into one of the best catchers in the major leagues. He is a splendid receiver, has a fine throwing arm, and is a fairly good hitter. You hear that limp last part? It was a hint. As it turned out, Ambrose Ogrodowski couldn't play. The Cardinals gave him 184 games, split about evenly between 1936 and 1937, and he hit .231 with a .263 on base and a .318 slugging with 4 home runs and about 1 full season's worth of plate appearances. That's a 57 OPS plus, and that was it. He was done in the majors. He went off to the Pacific Coast League and spent 7 years with the Seals playing for Lefty O'Doul. It was O'Doul and Ogrodowski, and they were both caught by Batman and arrested by Chief O'Hara. Spring training 1936 found DeLancey in Arizona, not to work out with the team, but taking in the dry desert air. It was expected he'd remain there for months. In fact, he never left. Well, that's a slight exaggeration, as you'll see in a moment. He was placed on the voluntarily retired list while he recuperated, and he was in extremely bad shape. Not just bad baseball shape, but he wasn't able to get out of bed or even sit up for very long for the inability to breathe. Now, like all of us, Branch Rickey could be a mixed bag. He had his good deeds, which we all know about, and his baseball brilliance, which we also all know about, but he was also a bit of a used car salesman when it came to negotiating with owners and general managers. You heard some of that just now with his description of Ogrodowski, what a splendid player he was. He wasn't even replacement level, and while I don't think Rickey had perfect foreknowledge of that, because if he had, he wouldn't have given him as many chances as he did, but he had to have some sense that he wasn't a coming Johnny Bench either, whatever the 1935 analogy is, Mickey Cochran, basically. Or more aptly, Bill DeLancey. So whereas he liked to come off as a very moral man, and I think to a large extent he was, he also wasn't above taking advantage of other people who might want to do business with him. And of course, some of his good deeds did have a self-aggrandizing element. So, big surprise, no one is perfect. But having said that, I think this next bit I'm about to tell you speaks very highly of him. As Bill was out in Arizona just trying to breathe, Rickey wrote to Bill's wife, Frances, saying, listen, write me frequently. Don't tell him you're doing it. Just write me. Let me know how he's doing. So Francis wrote back to Ricky saying, Mr. Ricky, he's depressed. Really, really depressed. He's saying things like, if I can't play ball again, what's the use of living? I don't want to be an invalid for life. She posts that letter to St. Louis, and the next thing she knows, ding dong, Branch Ricky is at the door in Phoenix, Arizona. He asks Francine to go for a walk while he talks to Bill privately and ends up sitting with him for 5 hours. Now, I don't know exactly what Ricky said to Bill DeLancey, but based on ensuing events, it's safe to infer that he promised Bill that no matter what happened, the Cardinals would take care of him and have a place for him in baseball. There wasn't a team in Phoenix at that moment, but Ricky must have known that the Arizona-Texas League was about to be formed, and Ricky told Bill, if not that minute, then later, that, and this is a quote, he was very much interested in Phoenix, and I would want your identification, Bill's identification, with any prospective club that the Cardinals might place there. In other words, Ricky said, you and I will take care of Phoenix in any league which will be formed. DeLancey's mood improved, and so did his health. Francine bought him a bulldog to train, and he bonded with it. That helped too. He started walking the dog, which meant he was out of bed. That was another milestone on the road to recovery. He raised some horses and started riding, and that's an incredible thing given that for 8 months he was confined to bed, and for half that time he could only sit up in bed at about 30 minutes total for the day. A few minutes here, a few minutes there. And so that he was moving at all was just a huge, huge thing. Now, he wasn't ready, even given all that, able to play again, but in 1937, Ricky gave him a chance to manage the Class D, low minor league Albuquerque Cardinals, and he did that for 3 years, only taking the odd at bat. It wasn't like he was all better. It just happened that the Cardinals had a farm team where DeLancey could work and baby his lungs at the same time, but Ricky didn't have to put him there, of course. He won 2 pennants in 3 years, albeit without much in the way of future major league talent. I guess that's more impressive. Actually, I should qualify that. I don't know if it was future major league talent, because if you were in the low minor leagues in 1937, if you were 17 years old or so at that point, you were going to serve in the military in World War II and have your career badly disrupted, if not ended, altogether. And that happened to a lot of the players that DeLancey had on those Albuquerque teams. DeLancey was still in his 20s, and he kept working hard, hoping that he could come back somehow. He started walking, got up to about 10 miles a day to build his endurance. And in 1940, after 4 years away from the major leagues, he said he was ready to come back. I figure I'm still good for a few more games in the majors. It was a tall order, though, not just due to his health and his long atrophying layoff, but because the Cardinals were pretty well set behind the plate. They had Mickey Owen, who wasn't much of a hitter but had a very good defensive reputation. They had Don Padgett, a former outfielder with great hitting ability, who Ricky was stubbornly trying to wedge behind the plate. I told that story back in episode 146. They also had Walker Cooper, 25 years old, just coming up. He would turn out to be an all-star level catcher for both the Cardinals and the Giants. So DeLancey was trying to push his way into the picture as a third catcher, and that's all that anyone thought was realistic for him. Even Bill himself. I don't say that I'll be able to stand up under the grind as I did in 1934, he said, but I think I can do a fair job of relief receiving and also take a starting turn every so often. There's always a lot a catcher can do around the ballpark, and I'll be able to make myself useful. He wrote Sam Breeden, the owner, saying, just don't expect too much of me and you might get a pleasant surprise. Well, how do you say no to that? Breeden didn't. Branch Ricky didn't. Everyone knew that asking him to catch regularly or semi-regularly would be too debilitating, possibly dangerous, but they put DeLancey on the team, and he mostly sat. He didn't start a single game. He was like one of those Rule 5 picks who you have to stick on the roster but can't risk playing. He got 18 at-bats in the whole 154-game season, and I think everyone was fine with that. Maybe it handicapped the team in some sense, but it was the better thing to do, the humane thing to do. Just like all of us, sports writers can be really irresponsible in the things that they write, the wishful thinking that they enable, the rumors they pass along. That May, St. Louis sports writer J. Roy Stockton wrote that if the Cardinals fired their then manager, Ray Blades, DeLancey would be in line to take over. Bill, if his health holds out, should be back next year as the potential number one catcher. He is still young, but 4 years of illness and months in the Valley of the Shadow made for a remarkable change in DeLancey. He grew up in those 4 years, and he's old enough now to be considered as a leader of men. Breeden and Ricky might even be thinking it over. Were they? I very much doubt it. Being a major league manager has a grinding aspect to it, too. And when they did indeed fire Blades in June, they replaced him with a much more experienced choice, Billy Southworth. And so it was all wishful thinking, including DeLancey's chances of being a starter. Somewhere along the line, DeLancey's diagnosis seems to have changed from, gosh, but he has a really persistent lung infection, to, it's tuberculosis and it's not going away. He knew that as of June 1940, when he was quoted as saying he was determined to lick this TB thing. But no one did lick it, not back then. He never played after 1940. DeLancey's final career line was 219 games, 686 plate appearances. He hit .289 with a .380 on base, .472 slugging. That's a .122 OPS plus. He had about 162 games of plate appearances, at least assuming you hit leadoff, and he had 32 doubles, 10 triples, 19 home runs, drew 85 walks. Bob Brogue, the longtime St. Louis sports writer, told Peter Golenbach for his book on the Cardinals, I always ranked DeLancey as one of the 3 greatest catchers ever to play the game, even though he only played parts of 4 years in the big leagues. He was a knock-kneed left-hander, had a good throwing arm, and he could say to Dean, you big expletive, don't you jake on me. Diz loved it. Well, maybe Diz did, but the ability to keep Dizzy Dean on task does not necessarily make one an all-time great player. DeLancey played 2.5 seasons, and one was excellent, the other merely good, and as for the rest, we can't say. As much potential as he had, as much as Brogue would have liked him to play another 12 years and have 7 or 8 of them be great, it just didn't happen in this universe. And what Brogue was doing was romanticizing someone he felt bad about as a way of heightening his story to the level of tragedy, but it didn't need that help. It already was tragic. The next year, Ricky sent DeLancey to manage Pocatello of the Pioneer League. He did play a bit there, but he was basically done at 29 years old. He managed one more year after that for yet another Cardinals team, this time the Class D Asheville Tourists, and then he went home, but not wholly for good. He worked as a sporting goods salesman and, as there was a war on, as the commissioner of a servicemen's league. He still wanted to be around the game, so in August 1945, he strapped on a chest protector and started umpiring semi-pro games in Phoenix. He even umpired an exhibition between the Browns and the Cubs. But, just like FDR's damp mail, that might have been pushing too hard. By March 1946, he was again confined to bed. He never got up again. He died on his 35th birthday, November 28th, 1946. And I think, again, that's it. That's all I get. And Bill got quite a lot, really, if you think about it. He got 35 years, a wife, Francine, 2 daughters, Doris Ann and Mary Jane. Mary Jane was just 1 year old when he died. She might still be around. I hope she is. He got to be a Cardinal and be part of the Gas House Gang, a team that people still write books about and celebrate, and he won a World Series. It's not nothing. It's less than some get and a lot more than some others do. You and I could get less than that. We could do none of the things that Bill DeLancey got to do. Never find love in our lives, never know the joy of having children, never feel the sense of accomplishment that comes with beating the Detroit Tigers in the World Series. Not that the Tigers have held up their end of that bargain lately. But hey, they might any day now. They're getting better all the time. This year, they added 30 wins over what they had done in 2019, and if they do that again in 2022, they'll win 107 games. They won't, but wouldn't you like to be around just in case they do? A lot has changed lately, and this is a year-end version of what I've been saying to you since early spring 2020? I even said it last week as the reality of this latest wave of the virus became painfully apparent. We're not shutting down again, not because we shouldn't, but because no one wants to do it. It's too hard. I don't want to make this political this time, so I'm not going to. I just want to say we've all had time robbed from us in certain ways. Things we would have done since 2020, people we would have seen, events we would have attended, vacations we might have taken, even work trips that we might have gone on. There are things that have been stolen from us that we'll never get back. A friend of mine, his son graduated high school at the end of 2020. Did he get a senior prom? No, he did not. Is that the worst thing that's ever going to happen to him? I hope it is, because it's not that bad, right? But that's kind of on a small scale what's happening to us in myriad ways throughout our lives. Maybe you miss going to Target. Sometimes it's fun to go to Target. As you'll hear me say to Ian Koss in just a few minutes, someone once told me that they wished they could disappear someone that they ostensibly loved or at least liked for long periods of time, something that flummoxed me at the time. Well, now we've all had the experience of our friends and loved ones being functionally vanished, except on the other side of a Zoom call. None of us want to go back there. So even though it is political, it can be political, it's about education in some ways. I don't want to hammer on that. I just want to say that I get it, and that here at this sentimental time of the year, I am asking you, if you are vaccinated, be careful out there. Breakthrough infections are reputedly mild, but who needs it? I'm not ready to stake my life on that. Don't you stake yours? Who needs it? Who enjoys a bad cold? But if you aren't vaccinated, or if you have a loved one who has thus far refused, then please exert every kind of pressure on them to take that step. I want them to be here with you, just as I want you here with me, so that we don't suffer what Bill DeLancey did by the random invasion of a germ into his body, which cost him his career and ultimately his life. None of us want to prematurely vanish into the past, into the infinite inning. We have come to the end of another episode and nearly our run for 2021. One more to go. You can follow As always, this is when I used to tell you how to follow the guest and me on Twitter. I am no longer on Twitter, and neither are you. However, you can follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. Ganged novel, and certainly my novel has been ganged, or if not ganged, gonged. You can write us at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Just go. Pictures, links, and Shanny Hogan is hoarding beer in case Prohibition is reinstated. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Gear of rudimentary kind available at teespring.com/stores/the-infinite-inning. Original soundtrack available at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with a moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, start a podcast about your pets without telling your pets that they're in a podcast about them. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, in the 1933 film Moonlight and Pretzels, Yip Harburg and Jay Gorney offered the musical suggestion, "Let's make love like crocodiles." In my opinion, this description of relationships has never been exceeded in the history of man. Well, if I can just break away from all these